Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rachel Strassman, and I am the former Dean's Chief Ambassador and host of the Policy Chats podcast for the UCR School of Public Policy. I am delighted to serve as your MC and moderator for today's event. The UCR Office of Alumni Engagement and the UCR School of Public Policy are excited to co-host this special webinar featuring UC Riverside faculty and alumni to help you understand tariffs and their impacts. We are honored to be joined today by an esteemed panel of experts, including Dr. Bruce Babcock, Associate Dean of the UCR School of Public Policy, Dr. Jana Grittersova, Associate Professor in the UCR Political Science Department, and Nicholas Adcock, President and CEO of the Greater Riverside Chambers of Commerce. We will start off with presentations by each of our panelists for the first 30 minutes of today's event. Then we will move on to a panel discussion for the next 30 minutes, which I will moderate. Finally, we will hold an audience Q&A for the final 30 minutes of the webinar, during which you can ask questions of any of our panelists. We just ask to please input your questions in the Q&A box instead of the chat. You can input your questions anytime between now and throughout the audience Q&A itself. Without further ado, we will now move on to individual presentations by our speakers. Our first speaker is Associate Dean Bruce Babcock. Professor Babcock teaches economics and public policy at UCR, and his research focuses on the impacts of agricultural and environmental policies. Before joining the UCR School of Public Policy, he was a professor of economics at Iowa State University, where he directed the Center for Agricultural and Rural Development from 1998 to 2011, and the Bio-Based Industry Center from 2012 to 2017. He received his PhD in Agricultural and Resource Economics from UC Berkeley and master's and bachelor's degrees from UC Davis. Associate Dean, the floor is now yours.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. Being the economist on this panel, I thought we should start out with just a bit of basics about tariffs. So what I want to cover is what tariffs are, what might their economic role be to make a country better off, whether the Trump tariff plans are in some sense consistent with policies that are designed to make a country better off, and then what would be the economic impact if the Trump tariff plans that he ran his campaign on and that he announced early in his second term here would actually come to fruition. So that's basically what I want to cover. So let's start. What are tariffs? Well, tariffs are a tax on imports. They're collected by a country's customs authority. The tax is paid by importers, and they're paid to the customs official. They are collected at one of the 328 official ports of entry into the United States. So a tariff is simply a tax on imports. So what might be the economic reason or justification for tariffs? Well, there are two justifications that economists have kind of come up with. The first one is that because tariffs are a tax, they generate revenue to operate government. Now, countries that have difficult time raising tax revenue, and those countries would be the ones that have large informal or off the books economic sectors, so lots of economic activities that are not reported to the government. Those countries find it very difficult to collect income taxes and sales taxes because income and sales are not reported. So they have a difficult time finding sources of tax revenue. But because tariffs are on imports and imports come into designated ports, the imports are easy to monitor, so they're easy to tax. So countries that have difficulty raising tax revenue find tariffs a convenient way to fund government. Second justification is to protect a particular industry in a country. Tariffs make imported goods more expensive, so what that does is create an economic advantage to the domestically produced goods that compete with the imports. For example, President Trump recently announced a 20% tax on Mexican tomatoes, fresh market tomatoes. And the reason is to protect Florida fresh tomato producers. They need protection because consumers have voted with their pocketbook that they like Mexican tomatoes better. So Trump wants to protect Florida tomato producers, so he puts a tariff on the Mexican producers. But that by itself is not an economic justification. All industries like protection against competition, but so what might be a justification for protecting an industry? Well, tariffs allow an infant industry, an industry that is not mature in a country, and so it might have higher costs of production. It allows them to compete against imports that are produced by companies that have lower costs of production. So economists sometimes say an infant industry can be protected by a tariff until it gets its costs lowered by learning by doing. So the question is, do either of these economic justifications are they relevant to the Trump tariffs? Well, in a word, no. The United States does not have trouble raising tax revenue. We don't have a large informal sector. And we don't have very many infant industries. The only infant industry I can think of right now is maybe the EV industry or the battery industry. But we really don't have infant industries to protect. So then why does President Trump want tariffs? Well, he says, and as some of his supporters say, that the tariffs are justified because they bring other countries to the negotiating table. But we've been negotiating reductions in tariffs since just after World War II, and some of the harshest tariffs that he's put on are two of our largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and they already have a trade agreement with the United States. So it's very difficult to justify the tariffs by the need to bring countries to the negotiating table. But another reason for tariffs is that they generate tremendous economic leverage over companies, industries, and countries. Think of the benefits that Apple enjoyed when President Trump removed the high tariffs that he imposed. They removed them from the imports of iPhones. That decision likely generated billions in benefits to Apple. It doesn't take too much imagination to conclude that the power to impose or to forgive tariffs generates tremendous economic leverage to extract concessions, either political or monetary. And, that might well be the ultimate justification for these tariffs war. And that's why economists generally support giving authority over tariffs to Congress rather than to a single person in the presidency. So just to conclude my segment, what would be the impact of tariffs if they are imposed? Well, in the short run, the price of goods on which we import would go up, but also the prices of domestically produced goods that use imports in the production process. For example, we have very low 50% tariffs on steel and on aluminum. Our automobile manufacturers use a lot of steel and aluminum in the production process. So the price of cars is going to go up. The cost of producing those goods is going to go up. And so in the short run, prices will rise. In the long run, putting tariff barriers around a country, what it really does is it reduces long-term economic wealth. Because one of the benefits of capitalism and free markets is that competition leads to innovation, leads to generation of wealth. So in the long run, I think when you put protection on, you reduce wealth. So I'll end it there. I hope that helped understand some of the basics of tariffs.
Thank you so much, Associate Dean Babcock. I think it's so important to have a general understanding of what tariffs are and what purpose they serve in order to evaluate them and understand them in our current context. With that, our next presenter is Associate Professor Jana Grittersova. Jana Grittersova is an Associate Professor of Political Science and cooperating faculty in the Department of Economics at UCR. Her research and teaching focus is on the political economy of international finance, monetary and fiscal policy, global banking, and European integration. Dr. Grittersova holds a PhD in government from Cornell University and in economics from the University of Economics in Bratislava, Slovakia. She also earned an MA in International Relations from the University of Kent in Canterbury, United Kingdom. She held academic appointments and fellowships at Stanford University, the University of California, Berkeley, Johns Hopkins University, Georgetown University, and the Paris School of Economics. Her professional experience includes serving as an economist at the European Commission and National Bank of Slovakia, and as a visiting researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco and the national banks of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Bulgaria. She has served as a consultant for the U.S. Department of State and as a fellow at the UC Institute on Global Conflict and Cooperation at the University of California, San Diego. I'd now like to hand it off to Professor Grittersova.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for attending this webinar. My presentation will focus on history and geopolitics related to tariff policy. Tariffs have been part of the US trade policy since the nation's early days. And in fact, it's important to discuss the history because President Trump has invoked a 19th century approach viewing tariffs not just as trade tools, but also as a major means of funding the federal government. The first major piece of legislation, which was passed by the US Congress, the Tariff Act of 1798, had the goal to generate revenue for the nation's federal government and pay down war debts. Alexander Hamilton, who was the first US Secretary of the Treasury, in his report on manufacturers, which is also it's also on this slide on the right-hand side, showed his strong support for tariffs to protect young American industries against established European industries, particularly the British competitors, using the infant industry protection rationale that Bruce already mentioned. The Tariff Act of 1798 was able to deliver significant federal revenues, but also increase tensions between the North, which was industrializing and favoring tariffs, and the agrarian South. But the most famous, or infamous, I would say, trade law that the US Congress passed was the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was implemented on the onset of the Great Depression to help American agriculture, which has slumped in the early 1920s. And it was very consequential and important because it raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported products, and the average US tariff on imports subjected to tariff had risen to over 59%. Obviously, this provoked massive retaliation from major trading partners, including Britain, France, Canada, and other trading partners, and led to the spread of global protectionism in 1930s. Global trade collapsed, and this disruption in trade flows also exacerbated the Great Depression, created uncertainty, and weakened international cooperation. So here are these two figures just to show you the impact of this most important and infamous Tariff Act, which on the right-hand side you see that the world trade has decreased from $5.3 billion in 1929 to $1.8 billion in 1943, and the tariffs also had substantial impact on U.S. equities even before this Tariff Act was signed. When it was signed to law, the stock prices plummeted, and the congressmen, they proposed this Tariff Act, Smoot and and wholly they lost their seats in midterm elections. So why I'm talking about that? Because many economists, including, and I think the most vocally, I would say, Doug Irwin from Dartmouth College, warned us that the current tariff policy is going to be much bigger than smooth Holy Act. And we see on this figure that the reciprocal in maximal scenario current tariff rates are much bigger. And the main argument that Doug Irwin mentioned is that this current trade policy will be even more consequential because not only how high tariff rates, but also the amount of trade imports are much greater as a share of GDP now that they were back in 1930s. They represent 14% of US GDP, which is about triple the share they accounted in 1930. And you also see on the right-hand side that the current tariffs also led to had a major impact on financial markets. So what are the main lessons from the history of trade protectionism? Not only these two acts, but also other tariff protectionist policies implemented by the US government and other governments in other parts of the world. So a country tariff is basically an outcome of domestic political process, right? So it's often reflects domestic political pressures rather than economic logic. Tariffs create winners and losers. And they are mostly paid by importers and consumers, not foreign exporters. They increase costs for importers and reduce purchasing power of consumers. Some specific industries may gain protection. Tariffs usually lead to misallocation of resources. They stifle competition, reduce productivity, and create also opportunities for corruption and lobbying. They can hinder economic growth because they lead to retaliation and trade wars, and so global trade contract. And as we learned when we discussed the story of the Great Recession, global trade contraction also lead to a slower economic growth. But the good news is that multilateral trade cooperation has historically promoted economic growth. We have the international institution called the World Trade Organization, which is designed to promote open trade, ensure non-discrimination through the most favored nation principle, and also provide dispute settlement mechanism. But the current US administration undermined the role of the World Trade Organization because it favored unilateral actions or bilateral negotiations over multilateral engagements. The US also blocked appointments to the WTO appellate body, which is the final court of appeal for trade disputes. And again, this led to it undermined the WTO dispute settlement system, which weakened global trade governance. And so, as a result, there is a reduced confidence in the United States as a champion of open and rule-based trade. And finally, I like to talk a little bit about the use of tariffs as a geopolitical tool, because unlike the traditional trade policy, which is focused on economic efficiency and comparative advantage, the US administration employed tariffs as a direct instrument of foreign policy and national security to promote the so-called America First doctrine, meaning these kind of tariffs are geopolitical tool to assert US power, to challenge perceived unfairness in the international system, and also to compel other nations to align with US priorities. The tariffs were targeted both adversaries such as China and allies, while trade deficits were cited in the case of China. Tariffs on China were primarily a tool to address intellectual property theft or forced technology transfer, etc. tariffs targeting allies like the European Union, Canada, or Mexico, or Japan on steel or aluminum, intended to put pressures on non-trade issues such as defense spending, immigration policy, or even control the inflow of fentanyl. So in sum, tariffs, current tariff policy in the US can have systemic geopolitical implications, can trigger global cascade of protectionism, and lead to the fragmentation of the global economy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Grittersova. I think a lot of people aren't aware of the history of tariff policy in the United States, and also it's valuable to get a perspective on not only the historical context, but how it's impacted the global economy in the past. So thank you so much. Last but not least to present is the President and CEO of the Greater Riverside Chambers of Commerce, Nicholas Adcock. In his role, he leads an organization of more than 1,100 member organizations, representing over 110,000 jobs across inland Southern California. He is focused on projects like securing state funding and accreditation for the UCR School of Medicine, advocating for relief for businesses against predatory litigation, and securing local control of Ontario International Airport. More recently, he worked with a coalition of stakeholders across California to advocate for critical legislation to reform the Private Attorneys General Act, a law costing businesses $10 billion annually in fines and litigation across the state. He is a product of the Riverside Unified School District and an alumnus of the Riverside Community College District and the University of California, Riverside. With that, take it away, President Adcock.
Thank you, Rachel, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. And in fact, it's great to see quite a few of you in the audience. I saw a few familiar faces and names, and so it's great to see so many people are interested in this particular topic because it is obviously something that's impacting businesses, but also residents, consumers alike in general. And I'm grateful for Dr. Grittersova and Dr. Babcock for really providing what I think is an important foundation for helping us to understand both the history of tariffs, the policy reasons why tariffs can be utilized, and unfortunately, sometimes some of the impacts that come from them, whether they be intended or not. The important thing that I really wanted to sort of speak to in my comments as we start off is the perspective of the business community. That is my day-to-day job. That is what I'm called to do. And so one of the things that I think it's important for many of our audience to understand is from the average business perspective, from the average business owner's perspective, business manager or business employee, what is the information that they are having to rely on in order to navigate a very complex tariff scenario? So here's an important thing to recognize. President Trump has been in office for 155 days. And if we think back over the past 155 days, it's a little bit hard to imagine all the different things that have happened over the course of this entire administration. And tariffs is only just one part of it. But part of that is also just all of these issues, whether it come through businesses that rely on some form of immigrant workforce, businesses that rely on a government process that they can find predictable, or businesses that rely on some degree of international trade as form of their business model. All of these things shape whether or not they can be successful. So I just thought it would be beneficial to sort of look at from an average business owner's perspective. What are the kind of things that they're seeing that helps them shape their decisions? So I just wanted to start off with just a brief sampling of a couple of headlines that I pulled from common news sources ever since the whole concept of tariffs was introduced way back in the campaign. So if we go back to even before the campaign, even before he was inaugurated, President Trump immediately started talking about imposing tariffs on some of the major trading partners in the United States. Okay, so that immediately sent immediate shockwaves there. But then we heard conflicting news saying that he was not expected to impose tariffs upon day one of his presidency. Then we heard that it was his team pulling back some of those rumors and that he was still very much looking at it forward. Then we have alternative entities, whether it be foreign governments or economic institutions saying, we're not sure, we don't think, but it's possible, we have to be prepared for all of the scenarios. Jump ahead, shortly into his presidency, into his administration, President Trump announces his intention to impose tariffs. That immediately gets a reaction from foreign trade partners who impose retaliatory tariffs. So we have that. Then, in the course of negotiation, you have tariffs that are paused for 90 days on some of our common trading partners. Then this all becomes a negotiation tactic where we have various different trade deals that are in discussion and people don't exactly know what this is. And there's some promise that trade tariffs could come down, but there's some uncertainty with all of that. But you also notice that in certain cases, and I'll go back to the comments that especially Dr. Babcock made, where you have countries that are looking to how they can insulate themselves from some of these different tariffs if they're an infant industry, or how they can basically try to make themselves more competitive without relying on some type of foreign trade. It's slightly ironic to me that that even when you look at some of these things, tariffs cross all manner of boundaries. So the most recent headline when you talk about Trump tariffs on China could affect the cost of fireworks as the 4th of July approaches. It's important to sort of note that these things impact so many different elements of products that we use every day. In fact, this one, which is one of the most demonstrative products that we use in patriotic displays, is now going to be impacted. Again, we have this back and forth where whether or not a trade deal is going to be done, whether or not trade tariffs are going to be imposed, and whether or not businesses are going to have to deal with that. Then, of course, as is sometimes happens in our American system of government, people decide to resolve these issues within the courts. And so you have a series of situations while different trade deals are being potentially negotiated, you have then situations where various lawsuits are being filed to determine whether or not the president even has the ability to impose tariffs, whether that's a function of Congress, and whether or not they are constitutional or not. So again, you have all of these things happening in real time, all in the same space. And so I share that because I want to demonstrate what is really essentially a simple point, which is tariffs in of themselves have an impact. And there's no doubt about it. And I think as Dr. Babcock and Dr. Grittersova indicated, there are reasons where tariffs have been used and there are impacts from those tariffs from a historical perspective. But I will tell you the most damaging thing that we have found from the businesses that we work most consistently is the uncertainty. That ping-ponging, that whiplash, that whipsawing action between whether or not tariffs are going to be imposed, whether they're not going to be imposed, whether or not they're going to be imposed but postponed, whether or not they're going to be imposed as part of a negotiating tactic to get various different parties to come to a negotiation table. All of this is coming around to a scenario where businesses are forcing themselves to make a decision that, you know what, maybe we won't make that decision of expanding our business. Maybe we won't enter that new market. Maybe we won't expand that product line. Maybe we won't create those jobs. And so it's a little bit hard to sort of predict where businesses can navigate through these things when even the conditions that businesses are being asked to navigate are changing so rapidly. So that's one of the important things that I think we have to look at when we talk about the impacts of tariffs. Tariffs can have an impact, and in some cases, those impacts can be positive or negative. And I think Dr. Grittersova and Dr. Babcock have illustrated some of those examples. But the thing that I really want to point out is the open negotiation, the open use of whether or not tariffs are going to be imposed, and having that be a tactic of negotiations can make a great deal of uncertainty that doesn't help businesses in a great deal of scenario. So I'm very interested to know what we can do to navigate through all of this. There are a couple of tools that I'm aware of to help businesses sort of navigate through all this. But importantly, for me, this is creating a very uncertain and rocky period that it makes it difficult for many of our businesses to figure out if they're going to invest in new markets, expand product lines, or create more jobs for many of our residents. So with that, I'm looking forward to seeing some of these conversations and the questions that you have provided. So with that, Rachel, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, President Adcock. As you mentioned, the tariff situation has been ever changing. It's involving countries, courts, and Congress. And as overwhelming as it may be to the individual, it's key to also consider how it impacts businesses and the decisions they're making every day. So thank you so much for your insights. At this point, we will now move on to a panel discussion with all three of our presenters together, and I will serve as our moderator. As a quick reminder to our virtual audience, you can submit your questions via the Q&A box anytime between now and our audience Q&A, which will follow our panel discussion. I've been seeing a few roll in, so please feel free to keep sending those in and throughout our discussion. And once again, please do not input your questions in the chat, but rather use the Q&A feature. So getting right into it, looking at some recent polls, according to a Gallup poll last April, 49% of surveyed Americans believe that the current tariffs are somewhat or very likely to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Why do you think Americans view tariffs as effective, despite broad criticism from economists, trade experts, and in many ways, the public? And any of our panelists, whoever would like to go first, feel free to answer this question.
Well,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, so here's the thing, right? Is I think you have to make sure you understand some underlying conditions when it comes to whether or not manufacturing is going to come back to the United States based on these. And I think Dr. Babcock and Dr. Grittersova could probably add to this comment, which is that manufacturing is not an easy industry. It's not one that you can start on a whim. You have to make sure, for one, that you have the facilities for it, the manufacturing plants. For one, second, you have to make sure that you have the supply chains that will provide those products. Number three, you have to ensure that you have, for one, depending on whatever it is you're producing, you have to make sure that you have the right equipment, the right tools, the right technology in order to make all of that happen. And fourthly, importantly, you have to make sure that you have the right workforce that is trained in producing all of those products. So, it's one of those things that I think it's a function of the fact that we would love to see an industry like manufacturing come back to the United States because historically it provided good quality jobs for a lot of Americans. I think just a lot of things needed to be in place before we immediately think that we're going to start manufacturing again to that quality and scale back in the United States. So that's kind of one of the things that I would be curious to know how we can build some of those other things before we really think about manufacturing coming back on day one. And I'll defer to Dr. Babcock because I think he probably had some comments to share.
Well, the loss of manufacturing, you know, has been with us since World War II. In fact, we kind of hit our nadir. We were the manufacturing king after World War II, and ever since then, there's been a long-term transition of the United States as we sought out better relations with countries, negotiated trade agreements, and lowered tariffs. And the purpose of that was to build up other countries as well as ourselves for foreign relations, but also over time, other countries are very good at producing things that we're not so good at producing. I'll just give you one example. Our apparel industry was a long-term apparel industry back in the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, but gradually labor became more scarce. It's a labor-intensive industry. It's a pretty low-wage industry. It's a manufacturing industry. And I find it very difficult to believe that people in the United States think that we're better off by devoting a lot of resources, a lot of labor to producing T-shirts and socks, underwear, dresses. Rather, we can import them for far less money and take that labor and move it into higher wage industries. And so that's been the big transition that has been happening since World War II. And it has made the United States tremendously wealthy. And so the idea that we're going to bring back labor-intensive manufacturing and bring back the good union jobs is a pipe dream. It's not going to happen. If we do put tariffs on that encourage manufacturers to come back, they'll be higher cost manufacturers than the manufacturers overseas that we could import. And we would have to take labor and factories and land and power and take it away from very high margin businesses and put it into very low margin businesses. So we made a choice after World War II to enter into trade agreements and let other countries produce what they're good at. We import, we export what we're good at producing, and the world becomes wealthier. That's the economic theory of what we've been following primarily since after World War II until recently.
So I like to maybe give a slightly different, maybe my argument was slightly different. So it's not just about the US somehow outsourcing its jobs, but it's the global economy has lost since 2014 20 million manufacturing jobs. Why? Because of increased productivity, because automation. So productivity improvements, automation also contribute to the loss of manufacturing jobs. And tariffs would not work to bring these jobs back. So we all face the manufacturing delusion. Tariffs would protect, for example, in US, only small share, about 10% of middle-class workers in goods producing sectors, remaining 90% of workers work in services. And, tariffs do not help these people. Also, manufacturing jobs are different than in the past. These are jobs for engineers, for technicians, people who have technical training, not just factory floor workers. So, we need different types of skill for these workers. So as today, I read today, currently we have 400,000 unfilled job vacancies in the US manufacturing sector. US companies are struggling to fill these positions because baby boomers are retiring, because of immigration, it's curtailed. And also young Americans are they show little interest in factory work. So instead of tariffs, we should put more efforts on vocational training, and preparing our workforce for a new type of manufacturing, for a new generation. But just responding to your question, Rachel, why do American citizens believe in tariffs? I think many American citizens believe that other countries engage in unfair trade practices. For example, we heard about how China manipulates the currency, and so these unfair trade practices somehow disadvantage US industries, and tariffs are perceived as a tool to ensure a level playing field for domestic businesses. And obviously, political leaders often frame tariffs as a kind of decisive action to protect American interests, and this can influence public opinion.
Thank you so much. I think you all touched upon how complicated bringing manufacturing back actually can be, and how much of a process it would be and the costs it may have in the US. But thinking about tariffs overall, who's going to pay that price when tariffs are imposed? Is it going to be foreign producers, American businesses, or American consumers? And how do these costs vary across different sectors of the US economy?
Can I go first? So I think you already, both of my my fellow panelists already mentioned American businesses, particularly those who rely on imports, and American consumers bear the vast majority of the costs when tariffs are imposed. American consumers, because as Bruce mentioned, tariffs are taxes on imported goods. And so, importing businesses typically pass on these increased costs on consumers in the form of higher prices for products. American businesses, importers, and those relying on imports obviously face higher prices of raw materials, intermediate components, or higher input costs due to tariffs, and this can erode their profit margins. Foreign producers can bear some share of these increased tariffs if they lower their prices to absorb some of the tariff costs and to maintain their market share. But this tariff pass-through, it's quite limited. And also, American exporters can be hurt by tariffs, can bear the price of tariffs because due to retaliation, right? So when other countries increase tariffs on the U.S. Exports, this makes American goods less competitive in foreign markets, and this would disadvantage also American exporters.
let me give an example of what was just stated. The original Trump announcement of the reciprocal tariffs had 50 to 60% tariff on China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, India, Thailand, Philippines. All the places where we get our clothing from, our apparels, we import from them. You put that kind of tax on, the first thing that an American retailer is going to be looking for is an alternative supplier. And if there are alternative suppliers, they'll switch and they'll try to minimize the impact of the tariff on their customers because the retailers don't want to raise prices. The problem is that we were getting something like 80% of our apparel from those countries that are now facing a 50% tax. There are no alternative suppliers. In that kind of a circumstance, almost all the tariff will be passed through to US consumers. Only if there are alternative suppliers, domestic suppliers perhaps, that can backfill from our more expensive imports, will consumers not bear the brunt of the tariffs. But the formula that the Trump administration used to put those reciprocal tariffs on basically assumed that about 80% of the tariff would be ultimately paid for by US consumers.
And I think I would echo these comments, and I'll say, the factor in all of this is to what degree of competition there is in some of these different industries. In the scenarios that they've just described, the producer is going to adjust their price point if they fear that, again, just exactly as Dr. Babcock stated, that the ultimate consumer, the ultimate client or customer, can easily switch to another product offered by another producer. But as what's happening here is that when you have certain industries where so much of the product being delivered to the consumer is dominated by one specific country or one specific grouping of countries, and then you have a tariff that's basically universally applied to so many of them in a broad capacity like that, ultimately it just means that they're just going to all pass the costs on to the consumer. There's not going to be that huge pressure for them to absorb some of that cost there. It is just going to get passed on to the consumer, and that's unfortunate because in so many cases, right, we don't have alternative options. We don't have multiple different sources in some of these cases to choose some of these things. And until we have either domestic sources or trade deals get negotiated, or some other source comes into play, these costs are going to be borne by the consumer.
Let me provide one more example. Easy. 50% tariff on steel. Oh, it's going to help us. But in fact, almost all the tin cans that we use in the United States are from imported steel because we don't have domestic producers of steel. So we're going to import that steel. We're going to pay the 50% tariff, and that's going to be borne by US consumers.
I just wanted to add also that there are different costs, or the tariffs can tend to disproportionately impact small and medium-sized businesses due to various reasons, because they have limited financial resources. They have also less leverage with suppliers. This is what Bruce mentioned, if they need to change suppliers. Navigating complex tariff regulations and various customer procedures can be also a huge burden for small, medium enterprises. They have also limited ability to pass on costs because, they may be less able to raise prices without losing price-sensitive customers. So I think we also have to keep in mind that tariffs would impact differently different businesses, depending on their size and also on the sector in which they operate. Car industry that Bruce mentioned, could be affected by steel and aluminum tariffs, etc.
Thank you all so much. And I think something you all talked about is how, in the absence of these alternatives, consumers do end up having to bear that cost. To try not to be redundant, is there any possibility for consumers to protect themselves from the impacts of the tariffs, or is it not really an option in the absence of alternative producers?
Well, I think I'll jump in here and say, that's it's important that as a consumer, you have the power of your purse, right? And while that is limited, while we've said in certain industries, right, the source of whatever product it is you're purchasing, if it's all coming predominantly from one area of the world or one specific country or whatever it is, to some degree you are limited there. But it's shopping around. It's trying to find alternative sources in some degrees that's easier or more difficult to do. But you do have that power of the purse. Otherwise, we have to start really thinking about how do we, in essence, figure out the best way to weather this storm until some of these things get worked out. And that's not an ideal scenario. That's not the answer I love giving. But what we are seeing is that this isn't as much about whether or not tariffs are going to be a long-term scenario. This is, can we bear the cost of a tariff long enough for some more advantageous trade deal to hopefully be worked out? And that's kind of where we are. So I don't know that there's like a short-term protection or mitigation for consumers against tariffs. I think the hope is that there are enough sources for some of these products in the marketplace to allow people to shop around to find whatever it is they're looking for at a more affordable price.
Maybe other way, I mean, I am a European, so one way that I can think of protecting, how consumers can protect themselves, it's maybe adjust their spending habits. So maybe spend a little bit less, save a little bit more, maybe postpone unnecessary large purchases like cars or some certain electronics, appliances. Again, this is a temporary measure, but as Nicholas mentioned, maybe tariff deals will be concluded, and so in the meantime, this is this is a kind of way how to somehow not completely avoiding the impact of tariffs, but mitigate their effects.
And maybe I want to jump in here and say, the question that also could be asked is it possible for businesses to protect themselves from the impacts of tariffs? And again, it's kind of the same thing. I mean, if you're a business that has to buy products, raw materials or whatever it is from a foreign company, a foreign source, you have to shop around too. And I think that's what some businesses are trying to do. It's just not the easiest thing in the world. There are some local tools that you can use. For example, in Western Riverside County, we have a foreign trade zone. That does help. There are some opportunities for businesses to avoid duties and tariffs, or delay them or defer them, to allow them to do that. Helps them to offer a more competitive price in the marketplace. So there are some of these tools, and there is one, in fact, in Riverside County. It's just, are people taking advantage of it? And so with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Babcock.
Well, you two have covered it pretty well. The power of the consumer is king. They can decide not to buy things. And in fact, President Trump justified some of his tariffs against China and the impact it might have on toy selection for Christmas, with the comment, well, you don't need 22 dolls or whatever it was. And that reflects the complete takeover of the Republican Party that President Trump has done. Historically, you never would have heard Republican Party say that government knows best about how many toys a family should buy. I mean, it's unheard of that our pursuit of low cost of living, greater consumer selection, is completely undermined by tariffs. And the idea that we're justifying that, we don't need all the choice, we don't need low prices, it shows you what a political revolution that we've had in terms of the Republican Party that has always stood for a limited government, free choice of consumers, and free markets.
Thank you all so much. I think, we've been focusing for a bit on these potential individual effects, but as Professor Grittersova talked about earlier, with those 1930s trade policies, there can be countrywide or even global impacts. So shifting to more of a broad US focus, to what extent do the current Trump administration's tariff policies pose a risk for a possible recession? I actually saw this in the Q&A already a few times pop up. And what protections are in place to prevent this from occurring?
Well, I'll jump in here. The protection that takes in place is a reaction of the bond markets. When the initial reciprocal tariffs were so out of bounds with any kind of expectation, the market reacted tremendously negatively. Bond prices went up because people feared about whether or not the United States, what their future economic policy was going to be. And what happened is that the tariff policy changed a lot. So what is limiting the damage and the risk to the economy is the feedback from the economy itself in terms of equity prices, in terms of bond prices. That's the biggest regulator. We should all go out and buy a drink for a bond trader because they are the ones that are keeping our tariff policy within bounds. Because one of the reasons we've had, as Nick was saying, the on tariff, off tariff, here, there, is because of the reaction of markets to some of the wilder proposals for tariffs.
And I think that's I want to really maybe emphasize the point is this is a little bit a function of the fact that these are trade deals that are being negotiated in a very public setting. I mean, candidly, I'm just thinking back to my own experience over the last, last of my career. Trade deals are not something that make headline news too often, except, when you have NAFTA or something that's really big like that. In most cases, these are inner workings of government. These are trade representatives and these are governments negotiating with each other for these different types of trade deals. What's happened here is that the spotlight that's been created on this issue because of this conversation on tariffs has now made, in my mind, all of this happening very publicly. And so what you have is what you have is normally an issue that is kind of folded into the normal operations of government now happening on a very public stage. And I think that's where the market is heavily reacting. You'll see businesses that are making decisions based upon whatever information they can pull together. And so that to me is kind of the one big challenge here above all else is that this is all on a very public stage. And it's very hard seeing businesses reacting to the latest information that they get on whatever media source that they utilize.
I like to respond to Rachel's question about risk for possible recession. While the recession is not a certainty, some commentators have already kind of predicted, assigned some probability of a recession. For example, an economist from Goldman Sachs have assigned a 45% probability of a recession within next 12 months. But what is concerning, is that most studies and institutions that project economic growth, including the International Monetary Fund or the Yale Budget Lab or Bloomberg or Goldman Sachs, they kind of argue that tariffs would reduce the U.S. Gross domestic product by between 0.7 and 0.9 percentage points in 2025. And as Nicholas mentioned before, it's not just the magnitude of tariffs, but also uncertainty. Uncertainty these tariffs create that poses greatest risk because businesses are reluctant to invest, they delay projects when they're uncertain about the trade rules they will face in the future. And this is the so-called uncertainty tax can also decrease economic growth. And what is important, and I study monetary policy, so this is very important for me, tariffs can fuel inflation, right? And Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell noted that we can enter into a period of stagflation, which means that you have low economic growth and high inflation. And so in this case, it will be very hard for the Federal Reserve to navigate in such an environment because in order to promote economic growth, the U.S. Fed can decrease inflation. can decrease interest rates, but it can fuel inflation even more. So it is a kind of situation that would be very difficult to deal with and may increase the probability of a recession in the future.
Thank you all. It is at least hopefully a little bit reassuring to our attendees today that, the bond markets are keeping us at bay for now, and that, we do have a recession is not necessarily the worst case scenario right now. But thinking about all this, we've talked about a lot how all of this is playing out on a very public stage. And it's given, I think, a lot of opportunities for people to share their insights as to how they would approach things differently. So, turning the table over to you, if you had to, each of you, redesign our current US tariff policy, how would you go about doing so, if at all?
I'm a big fan of rules-based trading. Rules-based trading are that you agree to rules ahead of time, and then you've negotiated those rules in a multilateral or a bilateral or trilateral, like the NAFTA was, and then you stick to it. And what that does is create certainty for business, certainty for consumers, and it keeps corruption to a minimum, because you can say, well, I can't do that. I got to follow the rules. So I would return to rules-based trading would be my first step.
And I would agree to that. I mean, I think the thing that I'll go back to my first comments is rules create a degree of certainty. If we know what the rules are of the game we're playing, then as a business owner, we can figure out how to serve ourselves and serve our customers. So in that particular respect, if I were to reinvent tariff policy, I'm not sure that creating economic isolationism is the way to go. I would find ways that we could be more competitive on a broader stage. I would find ways where we talked about how we make manufacturing easier to do in the United States. How we make it a more better product. Or if nothing else, try to figure out what industries we can specialize in that is easier for us to produce a certain product than it is in some other country. So I don't know if we can necessarily redo tariff policy. I would just necessarily say we need a degree of certainty with it, and then figure out what our economic advantage is, rather than trying to minimize the advantage of another competitor.
I would also agree with my and in order to target some kind of unfair trade practices, again, it's important to implement highly targeted, for example, target intellectual property theft, again, on multilateral basis, and perhaps implement high standard.
All right. I think Professor Grittersova is experiencing a little bit of technical difficulties, but oh, there she is. Professor Grittersova, can you hear us?
Yes, but I think I got interrupted, so I'm not sure how much you heard. But what I wanted to say again, for multilateralism, but instead of tariffs, I would, as I mentioned before, I would probably propose measures to increase competitiveness of the US domestic industries through investment in research, development, or innovation, and not protectionism. So as I mentioned, implement policies they would train or retrain an American workforce
Maybe I'll chime in there, because I definitely want to echo what Dr. Grittersova has said. I think the point that she was really trying to get to is we need to make ourselves more competitive on a world stage. I think it's important to note that manufacturing does exist in the United States. It just exists in very specific ways. We have aerospace manufacturing, we have green tech manufacturing, we have all different types of manufacturing. These are areas in which the United States excels because we have the trained workforce and the industry and infrastructure to do it. I think what we have to do is figure out what are these areas in which we are at the leading forefront of these industries and these producers of these key specific products, and really try to maximize those rather than trying to race toward the lowest common denominator in textiles or some other such thing in which another area of the world does a whole lot better and a whole lot cheaper. Apologies, I don't know if I'm paraphrasing too much of Dr. Grittersova, but that's what I think I heard her saying.
Let me chime in on that because, in fact, increasing productivity is the key to economic growth. And increase in tariffs, what they do is they decrease economic productivity because they isolate domestic businesses from the need to innovate as much. And so the United States economic growth over the last, let's say that since 1960, 1970, 1980, has largely been a function of innovation, a large part of which came about through federal sponsored research in high tech industries such as the IT, such as biomedical industries, such as those are the two big ones, but also agricultural productivity. We've invested billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayer money to research that then innovates and produces new technologies that we then use to have a comparative advantage and compete successfully around the world. So the idea of cutting research and productivity and investment and putting up tariff walls around our country is a recipe for slow growth and lack of innovation.
And I would just add that, in fact, we have the good news that is that the U.S. has started to rediscover industrial policy. The CHIPS Act or the Inflation Reduction Act propose some strategies to rebuild critical sectors such as semiconductors or green technology. And so there are ways how to rebuild this advanced manufacturing and promote high-tech sectors through private-public partnership.
Thank you so much, everyone, for such an insightful discussion. At this point, we will now be moving on to our audience Q&A. And audience members, as a final reminder, if you have any questions at all, please feel free to input them in the Q&A box instead of the chat. So with that, Professor Grittersova actually ended us off on a positive note, talking about how we do have some policies coming in, like the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, that are helping with industries and public-private partnerships. One of our attendees had a similar perspective and was asking if there were any examples of when tariffs were appropriately and successfully implemented in the US. Does anyone have any insights they could provide?
Well, okay. I don't know if it's been successful, but it's had an impact. We put tariffs on light pickup trucks from imported pickup trucks. And why do you think the imported pickup trucks are so small? They're all produced in the United States because we tax imported light duty pickup trucks. I don't count that as a success, though. Um, uh, but it definitely had an effect.
I think, I mean, I don't know that I can necessarily speak to specific examples there, but again, I'll go back to, I think one of the things Dr. Babcock said earlier is, um, there's a sense that it would make sense when you have nascent industries that don't really have their legs underneath them, in which you're trying to make them more competitive. And I think that those are those examples. But in a modern context, the United States is an advanced economy, and I just don't know that we have a large number of those types of industries where that would make sense. And so I think it's a nice sort of hypothetical exercise to talk about when they potentially worked, but I think sometimes historical examples don't do really a whole lot to help us in a modern context.
Thank you both. We also had, oh, Professor Grittersova.
Yeah, because I was again, I think my connection was interrupted. So what I meant, I didn't mean when I mentioned about when I mentioned industrial policy, I didn't mean tariffs. I meant kind of long-term planning, targeted subsidies, public-private coordination, not tariffs. I can't think of a successful case of tariff implementation in the US or worldwide. I teach international trade policy, and I teach my students how import substitution and industrialization in Latin America in 1980s, which used infant industry protection argument, failed in a series of crises in 1980s that involved over 40 countries, because these industries that were supposed to be, they were protected as infants and were supposed to export, never became competitive because because of this trade protection, because they didn't really face any competition. They had markets which were created for them by the government, right? So it's not tariffs. I meant kind of well elaborate industrial policy that would focus on competitiveness through domestic investments and innovation.
Thank you for the clarification. And I think hopefully, this ongoing tariff situation can inspire some, good policy change to get some of those examples of successful tariff policies. But moving on, we have another audience question from Dan Clower, who said that President Trump called on businesses to give up some of their profit by paying for the product, but not passing it on to consumers in price increases. Are there any ways that this could help us believe it could happen from a business perspective? Are there historical examples or potential models for which this could occur?
I mean, I think, um, you obviously you have to rely on high margin industries where that's even possible. Because if you're looking at a really low margin industry, asking somebody um, to accept an additional cost without passing it on to somebody is really tough. And so that becomes really problematic. I also think that, you're asking for a great deal of goodwill from businesses that already have to navigate a number of different things, everything from regulatory requirements to employer-employee requirements. And I'm just thinking of American businesses specifically. I think it's tough to ask a business to willingly lower their margin, not pass on a cost onto a consumer in the because a policy leader asked you to. I think that's just not perhaps realistic to what the realities are for many business owners.
If a Democrat had made that proposal, they would have been called a socialist, a communist, and it's anti-capitalist. And that's what it is when you're telling business how to make their pricing decisions, and it simply reflects the complete lack of appreciation of the benefits of capitalism and competition and the trust of the private sector to deliver goods and services to the United States. It's really anti-capitalist. So,
I would maybe not exactly address the question of how not to pass this cost on consumers, but the way how can businesses may adapt would be through particularly large businesses. They can seek to diversify their supply chains away from countries affected by tariffs, right? So they may shift sourcing from China to Vietnam or other countries. So this would be kind of the way how to maybe reduce these costs. And in fact, governments can even provide some incentives to corporations to explore new markets and new suppliers.
Thank you so much. We have another question that we already touched upon a little bit, but an audience member wanted further clarification regarding bringing manufacturing back. They have some questions about if it's even plausible to bring manufacturing back to the US, and if so, are there any models? I know Professor Grittersova mentioned that we currently have 400,000 unfilled manufacturing jobs in the US already. Is there a future in which you could see if we were to take a step back and focus on manufacturing and before we get to those tariffs? Is that possible, or do you not see that future?
The other two speakers have already addressed this. If we want to bring back manufacturing, we need to invest in our workforce and invest in our infrastructure. We need to build reliable grid. We need to have competitive energy costs. We need to have good land use planning. We need to invest in water supplies. We need to invest in the appropriate amount of education, which is computer training, training in AI. We need to be investing in our workforce and our infrastructure if we want to bring back, if we want to be competitive on manufacturing.
So I'll add to that and say, our Chamber of Commerce recently hosted a meeting with local education leaders and specifically two employers in the manufacturing space here locally. And it was interesting to me in that conversation, we talked about, obviously, how do we make ourselves more competitive? How do we make it easier for manufacturers to be competitive on a global scale and on a market? And it was interesting to me, one of the things that they quickly keyed upon was the ability to develop a very qualified, skilled workforce. And we're not just talking in the technical skills, we're talking in root problem solving. We're talking about getting people comfortable with the idea that in manufacturing, you rely on a process, right? But that process can create a product that maybe is flawed or creates, an unintended consequence or something like that. And so getting people that are in the manufacturing space, the actual workforce in the manufacturing space, looking at that process, looking at that product and going, okay, what caused that? That's a skill set that you have to teach because people don't always inherently have that. And so investment in workforce alone is huge because we just don't, we haven't in a modern context since basically the end of World War II, we haven't had the types of conditions that have created our workforce to be really competent in those spaces, and we have to really invest in that. And everything else that he said, I mean, trust me, we work on policy on how we can create reliable access to water for those types of industries that rely on that, reliable access to power, because again, these all create uncertainties. If you don't have reliable access to these things, then how can you as a business owner then look to expand?
So I already mentioned, and as my fellow panelists added to this argument about the need to retrain the labor force. But also what is important to mention is that the global economy now produces more manufactured goods with fewer factory workers. And why is that? Because of factory work is now highly automated. And so globally, manufacturing provides fewer jobs than in the past. And this is not just the case in the US, this is also the case in China. And also, many believe that you need factories, manufacturing industry to grow the economy, but it's not, it's not exactly true. For example, India's manufacturing share is now well below the target, but its economy it's growing quite strongly. And in terms of the, there are many institutions, including the Congressional Budget Office, that explains that perhaps between 1/5 and 1/3 of job losses are related to trade. The rest is related to automation and increase in productivity.
Thank you so much, everyone. We have another question from Eugene Heck, who asks about whether or not the current Trump administration tariffs will impact our relationship with the World Trade Organization. Do any of you have any perspectives on that question?
Jana, that's you.
Well, I guess I mentioned that it has already impacted, it undermined, in fact, the role of WTO organization, as I said, due to two reasons. One, because it favored unilateral actions in bilateral negotiations and bilateral deals. The one is coming up on July 9th with the EU, for example. And so this was one way how the Trump administration undermined the WTO's role. Also, since 2019, there has been no quorum of 3 judges that needed to hear appeals of dispute settlement decisions. So in this way, this administration, because it blocked appointments to this WTO Court of Appeal for trade disputes, also undermine the WTO's dispute settlement decisions, right? So there are two kind of main ways that hurt global trade governance. And also, as I mentioned, all these actions reduce also trust in the U.S., trust in its capacity to be champion of open trade, as is the past, or champion of rule-based trade. But the good news is that the U.S. accounts only for roughly 15 to 20% of the world trade. The other nations, the nations responsible for the remaining 80 to 80% of trade may be able to defend this rule-based trade system, right? So we may be able to preserve the global trade regime under the WTO.
And kind of going off of that, do you see any other countries that are acting in response to the US tariffs by going about and implementing similar systems, or is it really an isolated instance? One of our attendees asked just happening in the US.
Well, let me chime in. This is a complete anomaly. This decision by the Trump administration really disrupts post-World War II agreement about how countries are going to use the World Trade Organization and rules-based trade to try to accomplish something else. I don't know, but I think other countries are seeing the downside of go it alone kind of trade policy that the Trump administration is advocating, and they're seeking out cooperation between them. So you see Canada, which we had a tremendous trade agreement with for many years with Canada, United States, and Mexico. We have North American supply chains that have been operating to the benefit of producers in all 3 countries and consumers in all 3 countries. The Trump administration has disrupted that, and I see the Canada seeking out closer trade ties with the EU, for example, and with Mexico and with China. So there is a reaction to try to tighten ties between countries and loosen them with the United States.
So a final follow-up, or
Okay,
Professor Grittersova, you can go first.
I just wanted to add that there may be 2 scenarios. One scenario would be that, as Bruce mentioned, countries will go ahead and form regional trading agreements without the United States, or we may end up in a situation of kind of this competitive trading blocks, like during the Great Depression, 1930s, when for example, the UK established this preferential trade agreement with its former colonies to the detriment of the US, which led in the US to the 1934 Reciprocal Trade Act, which started, liberalization of trade policy. So we may see some reaction also to the actions of foreign governments to reciprocate, but also to promote trade liberalization, which would be disadvantageous to the US.
So to drive that point home, we had one final question related to that from an audience member who was wondering, how long will the rest of the world play along with this? Because in the beginning, I think as we kind of saw, there were countries that were coming to the table to negotiate with the Trump administration on the tariffs. Is there a point where we're going to get to where the other countries in the world are going to start doing those regional trade agreements, like you mentioned. And, American tariffs might not end up having an impact because they're not willing to negotiate, or is this not something that we foresee happening?
Well, I certainly want to defer to the other two panelists to see, but there's one thing I think we want to importantly mention is that despite some of the different sort of unique things that are happening here, the United States still is an important trade partner. There is a lot of buying power in the United States, and so there are foreign countries that want to sell their goods to American customers. So I think I understand the premise of the question. At what stage will sort of our trade partners really start to look in other directions? And that's a very valid question, but I do want to maybe just emphasize the point that there is still this isn't like we are asking them to come play with us. There is value in our trade partners and being part of this negotiation, or else they wouldn't even be coming to the table. So, I think we want to make sure that we're sort of saying what's the end game here that both serves U.S. interests and then our trade partners' interests as well, and what are the priorities that are going to make that happen? And kind of with that, I'll certainly defer to the other two panelists.
Let me just follow up on that point. It's very difficult to answer this question because there actually is no stated objective of U.S. trade policy. They say bring them to the table. The most coherent, well, it's not coherent, but the most often stated reason for all these tariffs is that other countries are taking advantage of us. And then the evidence of that is a trade in goods deficit. But that's not evidence. So it's very difficult to answer a question about what other countries are going to do when our government doesn't know why they're doing what they're doing. They have not provided a cogent justification for these trade policies. They simply say, oh, other countries are taking advantage of us. Then they point to a trade deficit, which is zero evidence that bilateral trade deficits that a country is taking advantage of us. So the end game, as Nick says, it's impossible to tell what the end game is because the Trump administration's policies are so unpredictable with regards to trade policy.
I would also agree with the argument about uncertainty and predictability of the US tariff and trade policy. I'm a little bit concerned about the possibility that global supply chains may be somehow reshaped with geopolitical imperatives. So we see that countries, governments are increasingly using tariffs to encourage companies to bring manufacturing back to their home countries or to their allies or allied nations. And so I'm worried about the world kind of being divided along geopolitical lines with exclusion of the United States, perhaps. But it's also one kind of broader point to make here. It appears that tariffs kind of appear to be part of broader change in the trade policy of the United States, not just, I would say, after 2008 financial crisis, because even the Biden administration, while toning down the rhetoric, and obviously we haven't seen the chaos and uncertainty as we observe now, but even the Biden administration has kept many of the tariffs in place, which kind of reflected bipartisan consensus on confronting China's trade practices. And so it looks like tariffs now are kind of a bipartisan tool of the US trade policy, which is also could be concerning for the international trade.
Thank you so much. And to wrap it up with one final question that we actually got from one of our registrants before the webinar, a lot of people were asking questions about how this will impact our local communities and specifically the Inland Empire. Does anyone have any insights on how the tariffs can impact very specifically the Inland Empire or in general our region as a whole?
Let me give you one quick indicator. At a Chamber of Commerce, many chambers of commerce do this. We offer certificates of origin, which basically is just a verification system that local businesses that do exports have to basically go to a chamber of commerce. We inspect some documentation and we basically verify that the products that they're exporting come from the United States, hence the certificate of origin. We've seen that activity slow down just because, again, the uncertainty created. We don't know if that is because of a broader economic factor or if that's specifically because of tariff and trade policy. So in that one respect, I think we are seeing a touch of a trend there. I think, when we talk about the Inland Empire, there are a large number of businesses that I think do export and import. Fortunately, we do have the foreign trade zone in Riverside County that helps with that regard, so it does mitigate some of that. But I do think we are starting to see some of that impact. And I think I just sort of go back to this uncertainty of the economy does make it difficult for some businesses to figure out what their next steps are going to be. So, I do think we are impacted. I think we're impacted as a region, and of course, obviously, as consumers of goods. So.
I can't really speak to the exact impact of tariffs on the Inland Empire, but one thing to kind of pay attention to is the possibility that tariffs will increase inflation, which will obviously impact also the Inland Empire and its and its citizens. And so we have not seen an increase. I think there was a question in the chat or Q&A. Why we don't see an increase in inflation. Well, so many companies, have kind of hoarded imports, and they use inventories to avoid rising prices, but they can't do this indefinitely. So we will eventually end up with higher inflation if tariff policy continues to be implemented.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left today for our audience questions. I want to thank our amazing panelists, Associate Dean Babcock, Professor Grittersova, and President Adcock. In these uncertain times, as we've been discussing, it's much appreciated to get to learn from your expertise and to provide some understanding despite the uncertainty. We're so thankful for you for joining us tonight and sharing your knowledge. Thank you as well to our audience members for spending this evening with us. We hope that you come away from this event with a better understanding of not only what tariffs are, but also their impacts. And as many of you may know, higher education currently is facing unprecedented threats to federal funding. This includes elimination of research grants and deep cuts to the Pell Grant program, which provides need-based financial aid to help low-income undergraduate students afford college. So if you would like to help advocate to keep funding higher education, we invite you to join the Highlander Advocacy Network, which provides regular updates on legislation affecting UCR and provides toolkits for you to make a difference. You can learn more by visiting the link sent in the chat. To our alumni, you should consider joining the UCR Alumni Association. Membership is completely free, and you receive discounts on travel and entertainment, as well as early access to special events like homecoming. On behalf of the UCR School of Public Policy, we invite you to also join us in the coming 2025 to 2026 school year to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. We will hold several big events featuring policymakers, practitioners, and researchers who are finding solutions for the region, solutions for the world. You can learn more and stay updated about events hosted by the UCR School of Public Policy by visiting our website at spp.ucr.edu. While you're there, you can also learn about our Master of Public Policy program and our official podcast, Policy Chats. With that, thank you all so much for being with us. Have a great rest of your night and a great start to your summer. Thank you.